I think we're at this inflection point, and the speed and the scale of the change too, Todd, is so big that I don't think this traditional rate-based model can bear the weight of all the investment that's about to come.
Welcome to Energy Solutions Podcast. I'm Todd Snitchler, President and CEO of the Electric Power Supply Association. That was Chris Ercoli, President and CEO of the Retail Energy Advancement League, or REAL. Consumers are already feeling pressure from rising electricity bills, while lawmakers across the country are debating how to build enough generation and grid infrastructure to meet growing demand from data centers, manufacturing, and electrification. For many states, the default approach has been to rely on traditional utility investment models where costs and risks are ultimately borne by ratepayers. In this episode, Chris joins the podcast to discuss why REAL believes competitive retail markets can help address affordability concerns, how customer choice is evolving beyond just price, and why more states are beginning to reconsider the role competition can play in meeting future electricity demand. Here's our conversation. Chris, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. You've spent your entire career working across energy policy, markets, development. How are you thinking about things or this moment in the power sector, especially from the retail side? Because we'll talk about that a little bit, but retail and wholesale are different. So how are you thinking about it from the retail side of the equation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're obviously, Todd, at one of the most kind of consequential moments in the power sector where we have this incredible amount of demand that's about to come online or is already coming online. And we're also seeing customers increasingly anxious about affordability, reliability. And the crazy thing is those two pressures are colliding in a very real way. And I guess one kind of anecdotal example of how we're experiencing this real time, and Todd, I'm sure you and many people in the energy sector are experiencing this, is in your personal life, you have people coming to you and asking you about their power bill. I have my parents, my friends, I had a college roommate who asked to get on a Zoom call with him and like half of the people in his neighborhood, how they can keep their costs in check. And it's really incredible for me to brag about my job at this moment in time, but people are in a very serious way struggling with, paying their bills every month at a time. So
yeah, and a lot of people are paying a lot of attention, including not just customers, but our friends in the political class. And I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. So
sure.
As you just noted, there's a lot of concern about electricity prices and rising electricity costs, all the things that we hear about, from friends and in our daily jobs. So especially as we head into summer where people's demand is going to go up, the air conditioners will come on, the windows will get closed. From your perspective, what's helping to drive some of that? I mean, yes, load growth, but I know you probably got more thoughts than just the really short answer. And do you think this is a short-term issue, or is this something that's more structural? Are we going to get through this in 12 months, or is this going to be a longer thing that we're going to have to wrestle with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think maybe I'll give kind of two answers. One is we do occasionally on the commodity side see blips in the radar. So you might have extreme weather events or global energy issues, and those things pop up. But then they, over a long time horizon, those things seem to kind of level out. What I find kind of incredible, and I'm sure this is something that you guys talk about quite a bit, is since we now have this spotlight on rates, we are realizing that we've kind of been this frog in the boiling pot for the past 2 decades. And really what it comes down to is we're seeing structural price escalation on the kind of poles and utilities side of the equation. And that's incredibly concerning because now that we are asking infrastructure to be built and we're putting more money into the rate base, though that kind of sustained structural price escalation that we've been having over the past 2 decades is now it's going to have this kind of hockey stick effect, and it's effectively running away from us. So the affordability concerns are real, but I guess what I would say is that you're going to have some kind of short-term pain with some of the weather events and energy issues that we're experiencing on the commodity side. But the thing that I think we really need to put a spotlight on is why have we had sustained structural growth on our kind of fixed infrastructure costs, and what are we doing to try and solve for that?
Yeah. So that is a really nice lead into the question I probably should have started with, Chris, which is tell us what REAL is for those that maybe aren't familiar with what your organization does and why do you exist? I mean, I think it's
Yeah,
a pretty important role that you fill, but not everybody maybe is as familiar because retail competition is not a thing in all 50 states. Maybe it should be, but maybe that's something you could explain to listeners a little bit about who REAL is and what you do and why.
sure. Yep, absolutely. So Real's mission is kind of right in the name, advancement. So the Retail Energy Advancement League. And I guess what I'd say is for far too long, we've stopped having real serious conversations about modernizing markets, expanding
Hmm.
competition, even when the kind of energy landscape has changed dramatically around us. And so with demand growing and with kind of just technology just really taking off, customers are wanting more flexibility. They want more control. They want more sophisticated energy products. But in many parts of the country, the market structure hasn't evolved with customer wants and needs. And so that's really where we fit in. We really want to push that conversation forward. And at the core of it, we think that markets should evolve alongside those customer needs. It's not a one size fits all solution anymore. And that's not to say that we're anti utility. We believe utilities are necessary. They maintain the grid, they provide critical infrastructure. But we just believe that competition and customer choice can really coexist along traditional utility service.
And I appreciate the way you kind of frame that it's got to evolve. No one's suggesting that the world is static and we can't possibly
Yeah.
change as the world changes around us. And I think that's where, on the wholesale side, we find ourselves similarly situated.
Yep.
So I've heard you say that customers look at their electric prices maybe in the wrong way. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So separate from kind of the structural cost issues that we've seen on basic infrastructure needs,
Hmm.
one of the things that I think a lot of people do when they look at they open up their bill, or lawmakers are constantly hearing about how their prices are better than their kind of neighboring states' prices.
Sure.
I think looking at the absolute price at a single moment in time, so like state A is cheaper than state B, is kind of the wrong way to evaluate prices. And the reason for that is every state has a different tax structure. They have different utility regulations, customer assistance programs, environmental goals,
Hmm.
and a lot of that stuff gets baked into rates. And so you really can't make a clean apples to apples comparison. And so the better question we like to ask is how have prices in your respective state evolved over time or performed over time?
Hmm.
And that's where things get really interesting. And so I'll just give you one example that I just love to point out because it's just the perfect model for what we're trying to talk about. Is you have the state of West Virginia where it sits in the RTO, it has access to the same natural resources as neighboring states like Pennsylvania, Ohio. And if you look at their prices over a 15 or 20-year term, their price increase, the price has escalated 97% in that term, second only to California. And so when you look at that relative to a Pennsylvania or an Ohio, where you have competitive wholesale markets, you've got
Hmm.
competitive retail markets, the prices have these moments of fluctuation. The market, I wouldn't say the commodity is not flat all the time, but when you look at it over that 15-year spread, their costs have only gone up 30%, 40%,
Hmm.
respectively. And so I don't want to gloss over the fact that West Virginia does have competitive prices in an absolute sense. But when you look at how it's performed over time, when you have a 97% spread versus we'll call it like a 40% spread, when prices are escalating and that spread is 50% or more, you
Right.
have to be asking yourself as a large industrial consumer that's maybe going to make a 10 or 15-year investment, do I want to be in the state that's had relatively flat price growth, or do I want to be in the state that has been growing exponentially for the last 15 years?
Yeah, I find that one of the troubling rhetorical games that gets played in some of these debates is that, well, your price is going to be as high as state X. Well, state X started with a baseline price that was already twice what the state they're trying to compare it was, and then say, see, that's what markets will get you is higher prices. It's like, no, actually, markets are mitigating that high cost state and not seeing the price increase. And if you don't dig in and just pull the onion back one level, that argument at face value, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. But then you think about it and you get a little bit of context, and all of a sudden it just completely destroys that argument. And it kind of reveals that the party that's making it may not have the best intentions in mind. So that may be part of why Real got started. And then now you've, of course, really started to work to build out your team and
Yep.
modernize and talk more about retail energy choice in a lot of jurisdictions, frankly. I'll let you talk about what all those are, but what's the current policy gap that Real's trying to fill, and where are the places that you're trying to fill it?
Yeah. So the way we are looking at our programming is we really want to focus on the states where lawmakers have really had decades of monopoly utility frameworks where they've only been hearing one side of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And the common assumption for lawmakers in many of these, we'll call them vertically integrated states, is that customers aren't sophisticated enough to make decisions about their own electricity supply themselves. And
Yeah.
we know that's not true. Consumers all the time make very complicated purchases. I just went online to shop for a mortgage. I shop for insurance.
Right.
We do internet and phone plans all the time. And so all of these products are layered with pricing structures and options. Sure. And electricity is important, but it's not uniquely complex. And we know that consumers are interested in having choice. One of the things that we did very early on was we conducted a poll through Emerson College, and we found that roughly 90% of consumers believe that they should be able to choose their own power, even if they don't want to shop for it. They said, well, maybe I just want default service, but that I still think I should have a choice.
Right.
And the same is actually more true for large industrial commercial customers. In restructured markets, over 90% of them choose something other than default service. And why do they do that? Because they have dedicated energy managers or procurement teams. They're highly sophisticated customers that are looking for a very tailored product. And so that's something that's really important for those customers where perhaps the number one operational spend is power or service. And when we try to fill this kind of education gap, we actually realized, I would say after 12 months of just getting the program in place and trying to educate folks, that it doesn't matter how hard we speak about the facts on the ground, customer engagement is vitally important.
Yeah.
And so we spend a lot of time for our programming on connecting customers with their lawmakers and allowing them to tell the story. And once they have that conversation, it doesn't become abstract policy anymore. It becomes meaningful opportunities to try and get something passed or move something forward.
Yeah, and I'll try to suppress my bias coming from a retail choice state where I chaired the commission and we did a lot of work on these issues more than a decade ago. But the outcomes were generally positive. And I think you're right. When you start with the commercials and industrials, virtually all of them in the state of Ohio are shopping customers. And of course, that bleeds down into the smaller customers, down even to residential, which is not true in every state, but that was our experience in Ohio. So at its core, when you talk about retail energy choice, what is it that we're trying to get to? I mean, at base, what is it that we're trying to offer customers?
Yeah. So I think it's important to talk about the two models that we have. So there's really kind of two ways you get service to your home and or to your business or what have you. And so in Southeast and much of the West, electricity is provided through this kind of traditional utility model, which the utility owns the power plants, they own the poles and the wires, they deliver the electricity to your home. And as a customer, you typically have one option. So that's kind of the traditional utility model. In states like Texas and Pennsylvania and Ohio, much of New England, there is retail competition. And in those markets, the local utility still owns and maintains the poles and the wires, and they restore the outages, and they're responsible for reliability. That distribution infrastructure is a natural monopoly, and so that's where the traditional utility model still makes sense. But on the ends, on the generation side, you've got your wholesale competition, which is what you guys do day in and day out. And then on the retail side, the actual customer relationship, that's where retail energy choice exists in these restructured markets. And so customers, they no longer have this one product. So one example that I love to use is the example of buying milk. And so years ago, the milkman had the cow, he had the truck, he put the milk on your doorstep, and that's it. You had one bottle of milk. But now you and I, we shop at the grocery store. That's our retail provider.
Yeah.
For me, Wegmans is the best grocery store of all time. That's where I was a cashier growing up. And my wife and I will go into that store, and there are dozens of options. And I'm an oat milk guy. My wife loves regular cow's milk, and my kids love to have this other option. And so you have all of these options. And so
Right.
electricity, from our perspective, should work the same way. Some customers are price sensitive. Others want long-term price certainty.
Mm-hmm.
Others want to better manage budgets within their household. Some may want renewable energy or some sort of customized energy product. And so all of these options now become available to you in a traditional utility model option, that all of these things that may be important to you don't exist.
And that almost sounds like consumer empowerment, but you're giving the consumer the ability to control a lot of the variables that are important to them. Is that how you look at that? Is that typically what you hear from the small business or the residential customer who says, well, I think I want to do this, but these are the things I think are important, or do they come at it from a different angle?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think one of the things that we actually find incredibly interesting is we've done quite a bit of polling on what consumers want. Consumers are willing to pay a little bit more if they can lock in a price for 3 years. So can they beat default service? A lot of people are price sensitive, and they will choose the least expensive product. But then when we start polling people and asking them truly what they want, if they could lock in a price, they're willing to pay a small premium for that, knowing that they don't have to think about their for 30 months or 36 months or whatever the kind of longest term is. That's incredibly important. Quite a number of people. The other thing is when we look at renewable energy, people are price sensitive around that too. So we will find that customers are willing to pay for more renewable energy in their product, and they're willing to pay a premium for it up to a certain extent.
Yep.
And so all of these things show us that when you just have a basic utility commodity offering, that's fine. Some people choose not to shop at all, but there's an overwhelming amount of people that when options are presented to them are willing to take something other than default service.
And I think you raised maybe one of the most important issues, that fixed means fixed contract price, where if you want to sign the longer term contract and be agnostic to capacity prices or fuel price adjustments or what have, you're not exposed to any of that volatility, and you can lock in your contract and, as you said, not have to think about it for whatever the period of time is. And I think sometimes that's lost on folks that are not actively in the shopping space at just how valuable that is. And I think in some ways that maybe changes the relationship that customers have between their energy provider, if it's a retail supplier versus the traditional utility. Do you think about that as you address these issues, or is that not a perspective that you spend time on?
I do. So the relationship with the supplier and the customer. So before I was here at Real, I worked at a company called Enernoc. And if you know Enernoc, they do demand response, but they also do kind of commissioning work and will audit buildings. And I remember it used to be called the Willis Tower in Chicago, and I forget what it's called now, but it's the tallest building in Chicago.
Yep.
I spent 3 months in that building, Todd, level by level, auditing light fixtures, cooling systems, how each floor gets water service. And at the end of that experience, we provide them a very customized solution on how to reduce their energy, how to shift their load, how to look at other supply options other than basic service for them to hedge. And we presented this whole plan to them. And that is effectively what retail service is. It's one product that the utility offers is a product that meets the utility's needs to recover costs. When you're talking about retail service now, it's not about the utility, it's about the customer.
Right.
And you are making sure that you are satisfying the customer's needs and providing them a product that works for them. And so just the whole concept of service changes entirely.
Yeah, as you described that, I was thinking of the Model T experience. What color do you offer it in? Any color you want, so long as it's black. I mean, that was the response when Henry Ford created the Model T, and that feels similar to how you were describing it. But you note a handful of things there in that description. You talked about flexibility or clean energy or control over your billing. What are you seeing in the terms of actual product development? I mean, for those who have ever been to Texas, you see the billboard signs and you may have gotten a mailer that says free nights and weekends or what have you. But I think those were maybe just the initial offerings and things have gotten far more sophisticated. What are you seeing in markets across the country where there's innovation being deployed and customers are having the ability to really customize or tailor, as you described, a product?
Yeah, so most of the innovation, I think, on the residential side is certainly happening in Texas right now.
Hmm.
On the C&I side, I think it's certainly happening just about everywhere. Suppliers get very creative, obviously, when they're trying to work with some of these larger customers. But one of the things that I think Texas does incredibly well is they are now, oftentimes when we're trying to satisfy supply and demand, all of the flexibility happened on the supply side of the
Yeah.
house. And now we're just seeing so much flexibility on the demand side to solve for these moments of, we'll call it peak service or peak load. And the great thing is that since you have so much innovation and there's all the red tape in Texas is effectively removed, suppliers are allowed to offer kind of these unique products that otherwise wouldn't be available. So you're having homeowners that have batteries behind the meter and are starting to contribute in demand response events. And you have the ability for you to allow your supplier to have control over equipment in your home, like thermostats, and being able to kind of shift when you preheat or pre-cool a home. And so all of these unique products are entering the marketplace there, and they are assigning value to them.
Hmm.
And that's something that you're just not seeing everywhere. And I would love to see it everywhere. And it's something that we certainly need to continue to work on. But I think one of the greatest things that we're seeing is just this ability for load to be able to participate in flexibility, to be able to allow the market to stabilize at ideally a price that's
Right.
affordable for people to pay.
Exactly. You noted before, we often talk about competition at the wholesale price. And of course, you focus on the retail side of things and choice for customers. But I think we'd agree that those are connected, right? I mean, you can't really have
Yeah.
meaningful retail choice without a robust competitive wholesale power market. Would you agree with that? And how would you describe the linkage? I know how I think about it, but you're on the other side of the table. How do you think about
Yeah.
that?
When I think about this, I almost want policymakers to go back and take Econ 101.
Right?
Because I'm like, it's really quite simple. When you have a lot of buyers and you have a lot of sellers, you create this marketplace that has innovation and competitive pricing.
Yeah.
And I think the more liquid the wholesale market is, the better positioned we are as, we'll
Hmm.
call it, retail suppliers, the better we are to deliver value and deliver it at a price that people are willing to pay.
Yeah. If there was one thing that you see in all the states that you're working in right now, I'm sure there's a long list, but if there was one top policy shift or change in perspective that you think would be really helpful, what is that?
Whew, good question.
All right, you can do three if you need to, but if there was one, what would it be?
I think the way I would answer that is I believe we need to allow large energy users, knowing that we're not going to completely restructure all markets, but at least at this point in time, since we're seeing so much demand, allowing large energy users to access merchant generation.
Yeah.
And that not only allows those large energy users to perhaps lock in a cost or have better terms and service,
Hmm.
but it sends a strong signal to the private investors that there's demand for new generation investment.
Yep.
And if we even open up one market that allows this, or maybe two markets, and we demonstrate success in showing that large energy users can have more competitive pricing relative
Hmm.
to their competitors, and that you're sending a strong signal to merchant generation, that's a tipping point. After one or two states, all the other states are going to follow suit. They have to. And so, Todd, the question I ask myself all the time is, this makes so much sense. Why is it not happening already? And so here's my wish. I wish that we could get the investor-owned utilities lobbying dollars out of the rate base in all markets, because we will win on the merits every single time. One example that I think about is Missouri, and you and I can certainly talk about Missouri because
Yeah.
you had the privilege of going there recently. I had to look up how many lobbyists the investor-owned utilities had in Missouri, and the number is 60. And to put that in perspective, there are 34 state senators. That means you could literally have 2 lobbyists at every state senator's office, being like effectively bouncers before you walk in to have a conversation with them. And that is just absolutely incredible. And I guess you have to then ask yourself the question, why do you need so many lobbyists? Well, I think it's because the industry is not on the right side of the argument. And so you have to pay for that influence and make sure that you've got people in front of these decision makers all the time. And so anyways, my wish would be that we got lobbying dollars for investor-owned utilities out of the rate base.
Well, since you already jumped to Missouri, I'm going to join you in the conversation about Missouri. So I did appreciate the invitation to come out and share a little bit from the wholesale perspective with lawmakers and policymakers there. From your perspective, being far more involved in some of the Missouri story, I just kind of got invited to come be part of the testimony, but you've been working on this issue there for some time. What stood out about the conversation, and why did you think our perspective would be helpful in advancing the discussion?
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation to have. So apart from the just blatant dishonesty of some of the opposing arguments that we had, just some of the utility talking points around competition just don't match the realities of the market. And so that's just incredibly frustrating.
Sure.
But Missouri is really confronting a real structural challenge. So the state is looking at significant planned generation retirements over the next decade.
Yep.
So about 40% of their existing generation is due to retire. And at the same time, they're experiencing this massive demand. And so when you add up retirements and what they expect to build because of the latest integrated resource plans that they have out, they need to close in on about 10,000 megawatts of new capacity. 10,000 megawatts.
Yeah.
And we're asking utilities that for the last decade or two don't have that kind of muscle to build out that generation because they haven't done it in a very long time. What you know that there's going to be cost overruns and you know that it's going to be very expensive. And I don't have to convince you of that. All you have to do is look at the legislation that they passed last year. So they passed legislation that allows them to do construction work in progress.
The dreaded QIP.
Yeah. And so utilities can begin recovering costs from customers before the generation even gets built. They are telling you what they are going to do. So I am concerned because I do think ratepayers in the state of Missouri are going to be facing substantial cost increases. And once you allow QIP out the door, the train's left the station, they're going to build, and that investment is going to get amortized over the next 20 or 30 years. And the bigger question we all should be asking ourselves is, should the utility be building it in the first place?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, as you point out, if you don't have the recent experience in doing it, you're no better situated than somebody like our members who that's what they do, is develop and build projects and add them to the system. And I think it's interesting, you mentioned 10,000 megawatts, and then you look at the size of the customer base that's there, and that's where it becomes really meaningful. And that was an interesting discussion from some of the senators before which I testified, talking about both their service and the rates that their customers are paying, and this new non-bypassable charge. They didn't seem to be favorably inclined to see another charge be added to their customers' bills, and the ability for that to be borne by shareholders and investors as opposed to being required to be collected from their customers was certainly something that they seemed pretty favorable about. Do you have an update? I know the Missouri session is either over or about to be over. So do you have an idea of where the legislation sits as we're speaking today?
So the legislation is still in both committees. What I find interesting, actually, Todd, is this is kind of indicative of most of the markets that we see retail legislation. I think, especially when we're talking about full market restructuring, it is a big ask, and it's an election year. And so I think just energy policy across the board, sure. I don't think anyone wants to make any waves in 2026, but we do know that there's strong interest next year post-election, and everyone feels like they're in a safer place to make some of these harder choices.
And I think that, not to get into the details of the legislation, I'll just say generally, I think that legislation did a nice job of accounting for some of the trials and errors of states that had gone before in a
Yep.
way to do it in a way that limits the ability for some of those things to happen again and actually start from a much better place. So, of course, if the invitation is offered to go back to Missouri next year, I now know how to get to Jefferson City, so I'd be happy to go. So I will leave that to you and your team about whether or not we want to talk about that. But Missouri's not alone in talking about demand growth. The country has been coming out of a period of relatively flat demand for close to 20 years, depending on what part of the country you're in. And the question is, how are we going to pay for it, right? Who's going to pay for the new demand?
Yep.
Large loads like data centers have all the attention for maybe good reason, maybe not. I think they're a useful whipping boy for some folks. But how are you thinking about that? Load growth is a real thing. It's an opportunity for customers to take control of their bill. I
Yep.
have to believe that you're in favor of that, but it's also good for folks that want to supply the electrons and do so in a way that shields customers. And that's where we fit in. So how are you thinking about how the retail piece fits into some of this load growth phenomenon that we're experiencing across the country?
Yeah, so a lot of the lawmakers and decision makers that we talk with really are asking the question, who should be paying for this? And we actually like to turn it a little bit and say, well, actually, the bigger question is who should be bearing risk? And we have billions and billions of dollars that are going to be invested in obviously transmission and generation
Yep.
and grid infrastructure. And under this traditional monopoly structure, the default answer is that the utilities make all of those investments. And then they just allocate it appropriately to the ratepayers who eventually end up absorbing all of that long-term financial risk. And our obviously concern with that is that there's a possibility that you're leaving smaller residential or small business customers subsidizing infrastructure that was built for this promise of something to come. So what does that look like? So the utilities might say that their demand projections are changing. They might say that their projects may underperform, or data centers become more efficient over time, or costs escalate, just operational costs escalate. In a traditional utility model, that all just gets passed on to the ratepayer. And you know this, Todd. In a private investment or merchant generation perspective, none of that, any of the unforeseen costs is absorbed by the private investor. It is not spread across the rate base. And so we just look at it from a who should bear the risk perspective. And when you look at it in that way, the answer is blatantly clear which option.
It's pretty clear.
Yeah,
exactly. So we're hearing rumblings in even restructured states about utilities that are trying to roll back competition, that somehow it has now become the inconvenient truth, or it's the reason that we have to change things because they want to own and operate power generation. And you've talked a little bit about what some of those risks are, but does that give you pause as you look at other states that are not restructured, or do you find yourself having to divide your time a little bit between new places where people need to see the benefits of competition versus those where some of the benefits may be taken for granted and we need to shore things up, where I know we're active, but I'm also curious how Real is prioritizing some of those issues?
So looking at when we're looking at new market opportunities specifically, Todd? Yeah. So when we're having these conversations, we like to talk about obviously who's going to bear the risk and why we should be speaking about private investment in generation. The other thing that we like to talk about, and I don't know if this answers your question, is in a lot of these vertically integrated markets that even have no RTO access, there is a laundry list of failed utility projects that we always can point to say, you made this mistake once already. Do you really want to make it again?
Yeah.
There's no better example than I'm in South Carolina currently at the moment, and we are still paying for a failed nuclear project that never was turned on.
Yeah.
And so that's a $12 billion project, $12 billion with a B, that ratepayers are still paying for. There are countless examples of that. There are countless examples of cost overruns, like we talked about with QUIP and the slippery slope with QUIP. And then there are other examples of where the project gets built, but all of a sudden the asset becomes uneconomic, and then you just have to mothball it. So again, we look at some of these things and we say to ourselves, it's clear that, and I should also say that private investment projects also fail. They don't always go right.
Sure.
But again, it's about risk. That private investor takes it on the chin.
Yep.
under a utility model, the ratepayers, like myself in South Carolina, are still paying for it, and you will continue to pay for it for the next 20 years.
And that's true from the retail side too. I think sometimes that's lost on folks. If you see the steel in the ground where our folks build a power plant and it's a poor decision, they can see that. But if you're a retail supplier that didn't secure enough supply or you didn't hedge your risk and you have a significant weather event, whether it's hot or cold weather, you're the one that's exposed to the loss as opposed to the customer ultimately being forced to pay those costs. And I think sometimes because the retail piece is a bit intangible, you can't see it like you can a power plant, that sometimes that gets lost. But that risk is borne by the retail supplier as well. And I think that's an
Yeah.
important thing for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, so that's probably the answer you were looking for. So let me give you an example of that, Todd. So Travis Kabula, if anyone follows Travis on Twitter, I believe he posted about this 2 or 3 weeks ago. So as a result of Winter Storm Fern, I believe that happened in late 2025, those costs are still coming through to customers' rates right now. And in ComEd in Illinois, the rate jumped from 8 cents to 18 cents to account for what happened over the winter months.
Right.
And that price shock is real. Customers are going to be opening their bill and saying, what the heck is going on? I can't believe that my utility bill just effectively doubled. And if you had gone to the market, if you had selected a fixed priced product over the winter and a 12-month product or even a 6-month product, you would have insulated yourself from all of that risk.
100%. Yeah. And that fuel cost adder, for those who may be skeptical of the example you offer, we don't often reference Winter Storm Uri, but there was a utility in the Southwest that had what amounts to, they've had to securitize this multiple $billion fuel charge, and
Yep.
they're doing it for a period of 20 years, and the customers are forced to pay that, where if you were a customer, as you described, who had a fixed price contract, you're not exposed to any of that. So I just think it's a difference. Sometimes we're criticized because, oh, well, people don't want to shop, or utilities integrated planning is much better and results in good outcomes. Well, right up until you have a $20 billion fuel surcharge that's got to be collected over multiple decades because the price is so high. So there's issues involved in every model. And sometimes you can probably tell, get a little annoyed with the bad examples that are repeatedly offered up, as to see if you just did it one way, the other way is clearly the better approach or the worse approach. So
Yeah.
as we get to the end here, Chris, tell me a little bit about where you're spending time to expand competition. You kind of talked about Missouri, but I know you're active in some other states where you've identified maybe the conditions are right for some expansion for retail choice. And talk a little bit about how you're thinking about that. It doesn't have to be the deep end of the pool. There are ways for states to get involved and see how it works and then evolve over time. So where are you doing that, and how are you thinking about approaches that might work in various places?
Sure. So we are actually, funny enough, we created this toolkit for what we're calling limited choice. And effectively, what that is, we want to start the conversation of retail choice, even if you're in a vertically integrated market.
Sure.
And what that looks like in practice is, let's start with the large, sophisticated industrial consumers that have at least a megawatt of load, because we know that they are going to have a procurement team that knows how to go to the market and actually do this, and create an opportunity for those large consumers to be able to go to the market and shop for their own power. And we actually think this is super helpful for lawmakers that are struggling with keeping manufacturing in some of these states that are exposed to significant price escalation. So we think that's really important. By doing this limited choice, it sends a signal to the legislature that choice isn't this big, scary thing that you need to think about if you're going to fully restructure. And so let's get our toe in the door. Let's prove concept. And if we need to march down from large, sophisticated energy users to small to medium business, let's continue to do that and demonstrate that choice is the preferred path for many of these consumers. That has been a very successful approach. We introduced it in a handful of states. We introduced it in Indiana, in West Virginia. And then since we have created this kind of toolkit to share with allies that may be interested in pushing it in other markets, we see it in almost a dozen states, some form of retail choice.
Okay.
And then we hope that after this kind of big 2026 election cycle, that this really starts to kind of gain traction. we have been so thrilled with the amount of folks that have taken interest in this.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that really, like I said earlier, if we can get one or two states that just allow us to introduce limited choice, create proof of concept, I don't see how it doesn't continue to take off.
Yeah, it's funny. You look back over history and the conditions seem very similar to when restructuring originally came to the States in the mid 90s and the early 2000s. So it was a lot of spending that may have been necessary, may have not. I mean, we look at the grid now and there's clearly the need for some spending. There's going to be need for investments about things and how do we best mitigate those costs? And I know you and I agree that allowing customers to have the ability to control their spend and to put the risk on shareholders and investors and not on the backs of Bob and Betty Buckeye, as we say in Ohio, is the better approach for us to do that. So as we look over the next 5 to 10 years, what gives you optimism about the future of power markets and retail competition? We've talked a little bit about it, but kind of your elevator pitch on what you see over the next decade or so.
So it's funny. So in West Virginia, it's Ed and Ethel. And so
that's a new one. I did not know that one, but okay.
Yeah, I didn't either. I think you actually just pointed it out. So what gives me confidence is history has shown us periods of this major load growth, and it forces people to question whether or not the status quo is actually working. I think we're at this inflection point, and the speed and the scale of the change too, Todd, is so big that I don't think this traditional rate-based model can bear the weight of all the investment that's about to come. And so at some point, I'm confident the policymakers are going to realize that there's this call to competitive markets and that private capital can respond to it. I don't know if lawmakers have found religion on that yet. I think we're still a few years out from that, but I think we're getting really close. So
we'll continue to share the good news with them. I am confident. We'll get them on the right side by the time
we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop.
Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for taking time to share a little bit about what you're doing and how REAL fits into the evolving energy marketplace and how you're helping states and policymakers think about things differently. I'm often reminded of the old Apple commercial, Think Different, but I often think that's where we are today, because if we don't do that, we're going to be stuck doing the same things over and over again. And we've seen that may not be a recipe for success.
Yep. I couldn't agree more.
Thanks very much for joining us, Chris. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Todd.
That was my conversation with Chris Ercoli, President and CEO of the Retail Energy Advancement League. As electricity demand accelerates and states confront the need for major infrastructure investment, debates around affordability, reliability, and customer choice are only becoming more important. As Chris discussed, competitive wholesale and retail markets offer an important alternative to traditional utility models by allowing private capital and not captive ratepayers to absorb the risk associated with new generation investment. Retail competition also gives customers more flexibility and control over how they buy electricity, whether that means seeking longer-term price certainty, customized energy solutions, renewable products, or tools that help better manage energy use and cost. And as states evaluate how to support economic growth, attract large industrial investment, and maintain reliability, competitive markets can help send stronger investment signals while encouraging innovation and customer-focused solutions. Thanks for listening to the Energy Solutions Podcast. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe and share it with your colleagues. And to learn more about how competitive power generators are helping meet rising electricity demand, visit EPSA.org. Music for this episode was produced and recorded by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Until next time, I'm Todd Snitchler.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, bringing about 225,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.